Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are looking at another vehicle which would be really nice to see in War Thunder, and sticking with the British theme, we're going with the A27L. Now this is the Cruiser Mark VIII, also known as the Centaur. Now the Centaur is one of those vehicles which is probably not well known when it comes to British tank designs, because a lot of people will get it mistaken and think it is a Cromwell. And the reason for that is pretty simple. If you look from the outside, it looks exactly like a Cromwell, so who can blame people for getting it wrong? But it is actually its own separate vehicle. It did have some unique features to it, and I think at least in War Thunder it would be a great vehicle to be able to fit into the game as maybe a D-Day event vehicle, or just a general event vehicle in its Mark IV setting. The Centaur differs from the Cromwell and also the Cavalier in a few distinct ways, mainly the engine which it used. The A27L specifically used the Liberty engine in it, and this was slightly different from the Cromwell one, and we'll get into why it used a different engine in a little bit. The story of these three vehicles, the Cavalier, the Cromwell and the Centaur, starts in 1940, when basically they were looking for a replacement for the Crusader tank. Now the Crusader tank had actually done pretty well, and also would continue to be in service for a decent time, because it actually got upgraded not just from its 2-pounder gun into a 6-pounder gun, but also in some other areas as well. But the problem that the design team had was they designed some decent ones around the idea of the Cromwell, the Centaur and the Cavalier, but they had a real problem with the engine. They were using the Nuffield Liberty engine at the time. It had very limited power, and if you know anything about the Liberty engine, it's actually a pretty interesting one. It's one which started as an aircraft engine, actually beginning in the First World War with the Liberty L12, and went through a bunch of different variants until it got to the Nuffield Liberty, which was a license-produced version, which was produced in World War II by the UK car manufacturer Nuffield. Now, the Liberty engine actually started off as an American engine, and then it went through a bunch of different variants of it in World War II. The one we're looking at today is the Mark IV variant, which had a horsepower of 410, and also they increased its governor limit to 1700 RPM and gave it a new intake manifold and carburetor for the tanks it was used on. Now, the vehicles themselves, the Cromwell, the Cavalier and also the Centaur, the major difference between them is the engines, and the reason is because they wanted to build a vehicle which would be based around the 6-pounder gun, so they built a nice turret on it, and this took a decent amount of time. It actually took until 1942 to produce a prototype with the required engine that they wanted to use, which was the 600 horsepower Meteor engine, which was based on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which you'll know from some of the aircraft that the British use. But the problem that they had with the engine was, even though it gave out a lot of power, even though the vehicles could motor around the place, it really had issues when it came to manufacturing and also when it came to cooling. Now, what you've got to understand during World War II is, in Britain, what was prioritized was the aircraft, for very obvious reasons. They were seen as one of the hallmarks of the defensive structure of Britain, especially in the early war years. You can have a look at the Battle of Britain, for example. This is why, when it comes to tanks, they're kind of seen as a secondary thing, or even a tertiary thing, because the naval forces of the UK were also incredibly important when it came to World War II. So unfortunately, tanks took a bit of a back seat when you compare them to other nations, such as Germany, such as America, and some of the other larger players. So the fact is, with British tanks, they were left in a pretty bad state, meaning that they had to use stuff from companies which generally didn't, produce tanks, but now they were forced to design them, now they were forced to build them, such as the Leyland and Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. They were chosen to actually fulfill the A27 program, and these guys were left to build these vehicles and find parts for them to be able to put together. So a lot of the times they would have wanted to use certain parts, such as the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine or the Meteor engine in their vehicles, but unfortunately they would have been prioritized to the aircraft before they got to the tanks. So what ended up happening a lot of the time, especially when we have a look at the Centaur tank, is instead of it using the Meteor engine, it had to actually have the Nuffield Liberty engine. So this meant that the Centaur was built, it meant that it was alive and ready to go, but it had a reduced power output compared to its Cromwell brethren. And also the back of it had to be slightly modified to be able to change or to be able to fit the engine. They actually had to elongate it a little bit, basically for the exhaust area. So yeah, it's pretty much as simple as that when it comes to the differences between them. And this means that, at least in War Thunder terms, the Centaur would be a slightly slower Cromwell from the outset. Now, as I said, when it came to the Centaur and even the Cromwell, the reason why it took so long to build these vehicles and why most of the time you know them from 1944 in the invasion of Normandy is because of the fact that the turret took so long to produce to create a decent fighting compartment which could house the 57mm main gun and also the coaxial Beza machine gun. This was the general gun that they wanted to use because at the time, especially going into 1941, the Germans had actually developed vehicles which had the long-barreled 50mm on them, the Panzer III, and was starting to look at stuff such as the long-barreled 75 on machines like the Panzer IV F2, for example. Now, the reason why the 57mm was so important in this regard was, even though it didn't add too much when it came to actual size of shell, what it added was penetration. And one of the things the British really valued in World War II was penetration on their anti-tank guns. Now, the 2-pounder would outrange vehicles such as the Germans with the short 50 and the short 37, but what they weren't able to do when the long 50 specifically came along in North Africa was outrange the tanks. They weren't able to penetrate the German tanks at range before the German tanks could get into range to fire back. So this meant, upgrades needed to be done. And that's where stuff like the 57mm comes from. That's where stuff like the 75 even comes from, even though that was more tailored towards infantry support ideas, whereas the 57 was very much designed for anti-tank use. Now, when it comes to the 57, it still had its issues when you think about when these vehicles were actually built, because they would face not just Panzer IVs, but Panthers, Tigers, and even some of the anti-tank machines like the Jagdpanther, which was being built at the time. But also understand that, the British had a counter to this, and this would have been the Sherman Firefly, something that maybe we'll talk about in the future. But when it comes to the Centaur itself, one of its more iconic versions, and probably the one which it's known most for, is actually the Centaur IV. And the reason why it's most known for this one is because, most of the surviving ones, or at least most that people know about, are Centaur IV variants, because these were used on D-Day, and these are the ones that are preserved. There's actually one which is preserved at Pegasus Bridge that I've actually been to in Normandy, and I would highly recommend going to Pegasus Bridge, by the way, if you are in the Normandy area. It's fantastic. There's a beautiful museum there. They have a bunch of memorabilia and also some vehicles and even part of the old bridge, which is pretty cool. So what is key about the Centaur IV version? Well, it's the close support version, and it doesn't have the 57. Instead, what it has is the 95mm howitzer, and this was actually used in the invasion of Normandy. It was used as fire support to infantry on places like Sword Beach. So it would be sat, at the end of the beach, giving fire to the infantry to try and help them push through the beach itself. And that's where it kind of gets its notoriety. It's not the same as like the Cromwell, which is mainly known for its 57 or 75mm versions. This one is known for its 95mm version, which is why it would be nice to see the 95mm version in the game. There's also 114 of them produced with the Centaur IV configuration. And what is kind of interesting with the Centaur as well is there was a few of them which were converted to, in quotations, Cromwells as well. There was around about 950 Centaurs built. It's about a range of 950 to about 1100. It's a little bit odd because, so when you've got two very similar vehicles in the form of the Cromwell and the Centaur, what you've got to understand is at some points some wires are going to get crossed. And even though a lot of Centaurs were used for training, they were used during D-Day, what also happened to them is some of them by the end of the war were converted into Cromwells, meaning they got the new engine, which, the Cromwell used. But some of them were actually changed to Cromwells by name, but also kept the old engine, which the Centaur used. So it's a little bit odd when it comes to how many of these were actually used, how many were produced, because there's so much cross-contamination between which vehicle was which when it came to these two things. But there's a rough estimate of around about 950 to about 1100 of Centaurs built. So this is not something which is a vehicle which wasn't mass-produced. That's obviously pretty mass-produced, and also at the same time was used a lot during the Second World War. And not just in training purposes, but also actually used with main forces. There was even a little Dozer variant, and the Bovington guys have actually done a pretty cool video on the Dozer variant itself, just talking about what it was used for and why it was produced. Mainly produced to keep up with the standard tank columns at the time, and also to be able to clear rubble and stuff out of cities, which the British had bombed beforehand. There was also other variants, such as a Kangaroo variant and an ARV variant that was built. But generally these vehicles were used a lot, and I don't want them to be forgotten, because it's too easy to forget these things, to try and see them as just Cromwells. But the Cavalier, the Centaur, and the Cromwell were three very distinct tanks with very distinct roles to play on the battlefield. So I'm hoping that we see this thing at some point. I'm sure we will. It just depends on when. But anyway, until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Professor X 1718, Orange Tail, Sakoshi Tiger, BRFC 15, Teddy, John Ryman, Universe A, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, and then Kyle Kin, Barine, Lafouche, and also Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.